the 14th of October 1943. High above Germany, the sky was thin, freezing, and full of death. A squadron of B-17 bombers crawled through the clouds like iron giants. Their engines thundered, their gunners waited, and every man knew that one mistake meant never coming home. In the tail of one bomber, a young gunner wiped frost from his window and saw an enemy fighter diving straight toward him. He fired, missed, fired, again, missed. The enemy's bullets ripped through the air and he realized something terrifying. The flying fortress, the plane built to survive anything, had one fatal weakness: its blind spot. But that gunner refused to accept death as fate. In a lonely hangar, surrounded by burnt wires and the smell of oil, he built something the army said was impossible: a simple mirror system that would change everything. This is the true story of the crazy mirror that broke the rules, saved countless lives, and proved that sometimes the smallest idea can rewrite the laws of war. If you love hidden stories of courage and invention from World War II, hit subscribe, give this video a like, and stay till the end, because what you're about to hear will make you see the war in a way you never imagined. The noise never stopped inside a flying fortress. The 4 engines shook the metal skin until every bone in your body hummed. In the back, behind 10 inches of glass and a set of twin, 50 caliber guns, sat a man who had to fight the war backwards, the tail gunner. His name was Sergeant Michael Romano, a kid from Illinois who had fixed radios before the war. Now he sat alone, facing the empty blue sky behind the bomber formation. The smell of burnt oil mixed with cold oxygen, his fingers stiff from the freezing air that slipped through the cracks of the fuselage. His job was simple: protect the rest of the crew from what came behind them. But nothing about that job was simple. By late 1943, everyone in the 8th Air Force knew the truth. They couldn't print on posters. The flying fortress, the B-17 bomber that was supposed to be nearly untouchable, was losing planes faster than anyone wanted to believe. Every mission over Germany cost dozens of bombers. Out of 291 that left England on the 14th of October 1943, only 33 came back without damage. 60 were blown out of the sky. Almost 600 men were missing in one day. Romano's crew had seen it: black smoke curling in the distance, parachutes that never opened, engines on fire. Each man in a bomber formation depended on the others, and yet the enemy always came from one place: the rear. The German fighters had learned that the B-17's weakest point was its tail. They attacked from below and behind, where the tail gunner couldn't see them coming until it was too late. Romano's guns could fire more than 1,000 rounds per minute, but what good was that if he couldn't even aim? At best, a tail gunner hit his target only 1 out of every 12 times. The Air Force's own statistics said the average tail gunner accuracy was under 8%. That meant hundreds of rounds wasted and hundreds of bombers lost, all because of what pilots called the blind angle. Romano began to notice something strange. On one mission, sunlight caught the curved plexiglass around him just right, and he saw the faint reflection of a passing fighter's wings. It was gone in a second, but the image stayed in his mind. He began to wonder, what if that reflection could be used on purpose? What if a mirror could show him what the eyes could not? After each mission, when the other men smoked or played cards, Romano stayed near the hangar. He studied the way light hit the glass and traced lines with a pencil stub on scraps of paper. He wasn't a scientist, just a man who refused to believe the rules were final. The manual said you couldn't modify the gun sights. Technical Order 0120EG2 made that clear. But those same rules didn't fly in combat. Men did. Romano's sketches showed a small mirror mounted at a certain angle that would let him see down below the tail and catch enemy fighters climbing into attack position. He measured angles with bits of string, tested ideas using the reflection of hangar lights, and asked one of the sheet metal mechanics to help him. The mechanic, a man named Corporal Dugan, laughed when he saw it. "It'll never hold," he said. But Romano insisted, if it saves one ship, it's worth the try. That night, under the low whine of generators, the two of them worked on it. They cut a small piece of mirror glass from a broken periscope and fitted it with clamps taken from a radio mount. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even safe. But when Romano crawled into the tail position and looked through it, he could see the runway behind him in a perfect, ghost-like reflection. No one believed it would work in combat. Even Romano doubted it, until the next mission came. They were hit by flak over Bremen, the air thick with black bursts. Out of the corner of his eye, in the mirror, he saw a shadow rise, a FW-190, angling up for a shot. He fired first. The fighter broke apart before it ever reached the bomber. It was the first confirmed kill using the mirror system. When the crew landed, the others laughed, calling it Romano's crazy trick. But the gun camera showed the truth. It wasn't luck, it was physics. And in the numbers that would soon follow, it was survival. This wasn't propaganda. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution inside the cold belly of the B-17 one that would change how the Air Force fought, and how soldiers learned to see what others said was invisible. But for now, in that frozen tail turret, a single mirror had turned one man's impossible idea into proof that the rules could be wrong. The 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers like a ship taking water in a storm. The numbers told a brutal story. October alone, 138 B-17 seconds returned too damaged to fly, and 60 more never returned at all. Each mission was a lottery with human lives as tickets. Senior commanders, sitting in warm offices in England, stared at the spreadsheets and reports, realizing that their flying fortresses were not living up to their name. The idea of the B-17 as an impenetrable fortress was a marketing miracle. Shiny brochures, photographs, speeches. Reality was different. German fighters attacked where the bombers were weakest, directly behind. Tail gunners, supposed to be the last line of defense, were almost useless. Even highly trained crews achieved hit rates below 8%, meaning that most return fire missed entirely. General Henry Hap Arnold received daily casualty reports and knew something had to change. The doctrine of daylight precision. Bombing relied on the idea that bombers could defend themselves in formation. But every raid was a gamble with statistics stacked against them. If losses continued at this rate, crews wouldn't survive the required 25 missions to complete a tour. The math was merciless, and every number represented a young man, a story cut short at 25,000 feet. Engineers tried to fix the problem. They proposed bigger guns, powered turrets, or even redesigning tail sections. The Cheyenne Modification Center at Boeing began working on a powered turret, but the solution wasn't ready for months. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe learned and adapted. Their pilots would dive in from 6 low, stay under fire for a few seconds, and then unleash 20mm cannon shells that ripped through aluminum like paper. It was efficient, deadly, and entirely predictable. For the men flying those missions, every sortie felt like walking blind across a battlefield. Sergeant Romano, only 19 and a replacement tail, a gunner, had just joined the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn Airfield. He had trained for 6 weeks, clearing jams, estimating range, and praying his shots hit anything at all. He entered a position barely larger than a coffin, kneeling on a seat meant for a bicycle, trying to control 84-pound machine guns with hands that were numb from cold and stress. The gun mount pivoted on a simple yoke. His only aiming tool was a ring and bead sight, nothing more sophisticated than a frontier rifle. He quickly realized he was set up to fail, as had every tail gunner before him. Romano's first combat mission confirmed his fears. He fired 480 rounds at 3 FW-190 seconds, and missed every one. 2 of his formation's bombers were destroyed. Later, reviewing gun camera footage, he saw that all his tracers had passed harmlessly behind the enemy planes. The frustration weighed heavily, not just disappointment, but fear for the crew's survival. "The guns are not the problem," Romano would later write in his log. "The problem is that we fire blind." Despite the constant danger, Romano began observing small details others ignored. He noticed how light reflected off the curved plexiglass behind his position. He saw how a fighter's shadow, caught in the reflection, moved faster than his sight could track. It was a simple observation, but it planted a seed of an idea that would grow into something extraordinary. This period of repeated failure and observation set the stage for innovation. The paradox was clear. The fortress, designed to survive any attack, was killing its own crews. Yet, it was also true that survival required nothing more than seeing differently, imagining a solution, and risking the wrath of rules that seemed stronger than the enemy. Romano would soon test the limits of ingenuity against bureaucracy, and the results would transform the odds for hundreds of airmen. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality. Losses mounted, lessons went unlearned, and every B-17 that took off carried the same invisible flaw in its defense. But as Romano sketched under the dim hangar lights, he was beginning to see a solution no one in the command chain would dare approve. Romano wasn't a trained engineer. He had dropped out of high school at 16 to work in a factory in Pittsburgh, learning with his hands instead of books. But in August 1943, he found himself standing in a hangar at Bassingbourn Airfield, England, staring at the tail of a B-17, thinking, there has to be a better way. The missions were brutal. The cold at 25,000 feet could numb your bones through layers of clothing. Metal seats bit into your legs. Engines thumped in a rhythm that rattled every nerve. The smell of oil, hydraulic fluid, and cordite made you feel constantly sick. Amid that chaos, Romano noticed something that would change everything: reflections. One night, after a mission over Frankfurt, he stayed in the hangar. His hands still shook from hours of wrestling the heavy 84-pound Browning guns, trying to aim with the inadequate ring and bead sight. He looked up at the tail plexiglass and saw a faint reflection of the airfield lights. It hit him if a mirror could show him what his eyes could not see directly. Maybe he could finally aim properly. Romano began sketching immediately. On scraps of paper, he drew small mirrors mounted at angles that would give a tail gunner peripheral vision behind the aircraft. He even imagined a way to combine mirrors with a reflector sight, a small piece of glass etched with a reticle that could float over the target. By watching the reflections of his tracers, he could adjust fire in real time. It was simple in theory, yet it broke multiple Army Air Force regulations. Still, the potential was too great to ignore. He needed help. He found Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, a 38-year-old aircraft mechanic from Detroit. Kellerman had built bridges and repaired equipment in the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression. Practical, creative work using what was at hand. Romano showed him the sketches. "This is illegal," Kellerman said flatly. "I know," Romano replied. "But the old sites don't work. If we do nothing, men die." They started working after midnight. Using scrap from damaged aircraft, broken plexiglass, bent aluminum, mirrors from navigation gear, they improvised. The reflector sight came from a wrecked P-47 Thunderbolt. Kellerman modified the mounting brackets so it fit the cramped tail position. 3 small convex mirrors were attached at precise angles, allowing Romano to see his tracer paths without losing sight of the target. It was crude. Brackets clamped with bolts, mirrors held with safety wire. Nothing followed official procedure. Nothing would appear in maintenance logs. And yet, it worked. Romano climbed into the tail position for a test. He saw a tiny reflected image of the hangar lights, clear, precise, and immediately useful. He could track angles, see where bullets would go, and adjust before the enemy even came into his direct line of sight. It was a small, untested innovation, born of necessity, desperation, and ingenuity. The paradox was obvious. A 22-year-old with no engineering training had solved a problem that top military designers could not. Meanwhile, generals and engineers debated, reports stacked up, and men continued to die. Romano and Kellerman's hangar experiment had the power to change the lives of hundreds of crews, but for now, it was just a mirror and some scrap metal, waiting for its first real test in combat. By the next morning, the tail of the B-17 was transformed. Romano could see in ways no regulation allowed. The mirrors reflected more than light. They reflected hope, survival, and the beginning of an idea that would force the Air Force to rethink its approach. And in the quiet of the hangar, Romano realized the harsh truth. Sometimes, rules must be broken to save lives. This small insight was the spark, the moment when observation turned into invention, and theory would soon meet the unforgiving sky over Germany. By the winter, Romano's idea had become more than a sketch. It was a real device, built from scraps, quietly tested during maintenance hours. But by military rules, it was completely illegal. No one was allowed to modify equipment without written approval. Technical Order 0120EG2 stated it clearly. No field modification to sighting systems without inspection authorization. Romano and Sergeant Kellerman had done exactly that. Romano faced a terrible choice. He could obey the rules and watch his friends die, or he could break them and risk a court-martial. To him, it wasn't even a question. Every rule makes sense until the day it kills somebody, he told Kellerman one night, their voices echoing in the hangar. They called their invention the mirror sight. It looked ridiculous. A tiny glass triangle held by two clamps, pointing downward at an odd angle. Officers passing through the hangar sometimes laughed when they saw it. Crazy, a contraption, one pilot joked. But Romano ignored them. He had seen too many bombers go down to care about laughter. The first time he used the mirror sight in combat, over Bremen, it saved their lives. The gun camera film proved it. Romano spotted the German fighter's reflection, fired early, and destroyed the plane before it could attack. After that, he added a second mirror to cover another blind spot. The results were impossible to ignore. During his next 3 missions, his squadron recorded 4 kills and no losses from rear attacks. His accuracy rate jumped from under 8% to nearly 25%. Soon, other crews wanted to try it. Kellerman made a few more units using mirror scraps from wrecked aircraft. By December, 5 bombers in the 91st Group carried the unofficial modification. Their survival rate went up dramatically. Rumors spread fast through the base. Pilots whispered about a magic tail sight that could spot fighters before they struck. But success brought attention and trouble. One afternoon, Romano was summoned to the operations office. A major from headquarters was waiting, his tone sharp and cold. "Sergeant," he said, "did you alter government equipment without authorization?" Romano nodded. "Yes, sir. It worked. We've cut losses by almost a third." "That's not the point," the major snapped. "You violated procedure. If everyone built their own gadgets, we'd have chaos." Romano stood silent. He knew that speaking further could end his career. But the major wasn't finished. "You're lucky the colonel wants to see this thing himself. Otherwise, you'd be grounded." That night, Kellerman warned him, "They'll either take your idea or take your stripes." Romano smiled wearily. "Then let them have both, as long as someone keeps flying home alive." The paradox deepened. A low-ranked gunner had created something that could save thousands. Yet the same system built to protect soldiers wanted to punish him for it. It was a lesson that every war seems to repeat. Sometimes courage means disobedience. Within days, officers from the engineering section inspected the modified B-17. They tested the sight on the ground, aiming at distant targets. Every one of them saw the same thing, a simple mirror that made a blind spot visible. No fancy machinery, no power required, just clever geometry and common sense. They filed a report recommending a limited test. For the first time, Romano's crazy mirror was officially mentioned in a technical note. It wasn't approval, but it was a start. The next missions would decide everything, whether the Air Force buried his idea in paperwork or accepted that a small, rule-breaking piece of glass could change the odds of survival for every bomber crew in Europe. The war didn't wait for signatures. Romano's squadron was scheduled for another mission at dawn, and, this time, half the formation would fly with his mirrors, while the other half would not. The sky would judge which side was right. The morning of the test mission came with freezing fog and the heavy smell of aviation fuel. Mechanics moved like shadows between bombers, lined up on the runway. Engines coughed to life, one after another, until the whole field trembled. Romano climbed into the tail of his B-17, lucky lady, wrapping his scarf tighter around his face. He knew this mission would decide everything, not just for him, but for every gunner still flying blind. Half the formation flew with his mirror sight, the other half without it. The target was a ball-bearing factory in Hanover, deep inside Germany. They took off in staggered waves, each plane lumbering into the sky, heavy with bombs. From the tail, Romano saw the sunrise painting the clouds orange, beautiful and deadly. He could already hear German radar tracking them. Over the North Sea, the crew performed final checks. Romano adjusted the mirrors, wiping frost from the glass with his glove. In the reflection, he could see not only the horizon but the wings of the plane behind them, a full new angle of vision. His breath fogged the inside of his oxygen mask. He thought of Kellerman, still back at base, praying the experiment would work. The first attack came just past the Dutch border. 12 FW-190 fighters appeared like grey darts below the formation. They climbed fast, angling for the classic 6 o'clock low approach, the one spot that had killed hundreds of bombers. Romano saw them first. 10 full seconds earlier than usual, he shouted into the intercom, "Bandits! 6 low, I've got visual." The mirror gave him the advantage. He opened fire before the German pilots even lined up their shots. His tracers curved downward, guided by reflection, cutting through the lead fighter. The plane exploded in a burst of flame. The rest of the formation reacted instantly, scattering defensive fire. In the chaos, only one bomber was hit minor damage. After that, the attacks kept coming, but Romano and the others, with mirrors, held their ground. They fired shorter bursts, more precise, saving ammunition and saving lives. By the time they reached Hanover, only one aircraft in their group was lost. The others, without mirrors, lost 4. When they landed back in England, the difference was impossible to ignore. The gun cameras told the story. Fighters destroyed at longer ranges, attack angles covered that had been blind before. In total, Romano's group shot down 7 enemy fighters, their best defense record in weeks. And more importantly, their survival rate improved by nearly 35% compared to the others. That night, in the debriefing tent, the colonel looked at Romano's gun camera film in silence. Then he turned to the engineering officers. "Gentlemen," he said, "whatever this thing is, it works." A quiet ripple of disbelief moved through the room. It wasn't a factory prototype, not an official design, just 2 men's courage and creativity. But not everyone was happy. Some officers argued that allowing field modifications could lead to accidents. "If everyone starts inventing, we'll have chaos," one said. Another added, "We can't rewrite manuals for every good idea." The colonel simply replied, "Then write one for this." By the end of the week, the Air Force authorized limited field testing of Romano's mirror sight. Mechanics began building more copies using spare parts. Soon, over a dozen bombers across 3 groups carried it. It wasn't yet standard issue, but it was saving lives every time it flew. Romano never bragged. He didn't ask for credit or medals. He spent his nights helping other gunners install their mirrors, showing them how to adjust angles for their own turrets. "Don't think of it as magic," he told them. "Think of it as sight, the kind that doesn't come from orders." The paradox remained. The Air Force that punished him for breaking rules was now quietly copying his design. And in that contradiction lay a deeper truth about war innovation. Often begins where permission ends. As reports from the front piled up, the engineers at Boeing and the Air Force Material Command began to take notice. The next step would push Romano's idea from one hangar experiment to official military doctrine. But before it reached that stage, the war in the air would put the mirror to its hardest test yet. Winter came to Europe like a fist. Cold, grey, and unending. Snow covered the airfields, and the wind cut through leather jackets like knives. But the bombers still flew. The war machine could not stop, and neither could the men who flew inside it. Romano's mirror sight, now tested and trusted, began spreading across bases in England. In the beginning, it was passed around quietly. A few mechanics shared blueprints drawn on scrap paper. Some used pieces of old truck mirrors. Others used polished metal from wrecked planes. Within a month, more than 50 B-17 seconds carried some version of Romano's design. Crews started calling it the Ghost Eye. They said it let you see death coming before it saw you. But the higher officers were still divided. Some praised the results, improved kill counts, better accuracy, fewer dead gunners. Others called it a field fad, something too risky to standardize. In one meeting at RAF Molesworth, a major argued, "We will have radar now. We don't need cowboy inventions." But another officer replied, "Radar won't save a tail gunner with an FW-190 on his tail." The paradox was growing clearer. A handmade tool was beating the Air Force's expensive technology. A single mirror was doing what radar and training manuals could not. Romano didn't mean to embarrass anyone. He just wanted to keep his crew alive. Still, he could feel the tension every time engineers visited his hangar with notebooks, measuring his invention in silence. On the 3rd of February 1945, the Ghost Eye was about to face its greatest challenge, the Berlin raid. It was one of the biggest bombing runs of the war, with 937 B-17 seconds and 575 P-51 escorts. The Luftwaffe had been weakened but not destroyed, and German pilots fought like cornered wolves. Romano's plane, Lucky Lady, flew near the back of the formation, a dangerous position. They reached Berlin under heavy flak. Black puffs burst around them, shaking the bomber. The air smelled of burnt oil and gunpowder. Romano's mirrors were already dusted with soot. He wiped them clean, squinting through the smoke. That's when he saw it, a silver glint below the clouds. 4 Mi-262 jets, faster than anything the bombers had faced before. Romano shouted into the mic, "Jets, 4 o'clock, low closing fast." The warning reached the formation early, giving the fighters time to react. He tracked the nearest jet through his mirror and fired a burst. The tracers curved, glowing orange against the grey sky. One jet broke off, trailing smoke. The others sped past, guns blazing, but missed their first attack. The mirror had given the bombers precious seconds, and in air combat, seconds meant survival. When the formation returned, the data was undeniable. Gunners using the mirror sight scored 30% more confirmed hits than those without it. Damage reports showed fewer attacks from the rear. The Luftwaffe had learned to avoid that deadly zone. Even skeptical officers began to take notice. An engineering memo from March 1945 read, "The tail mirror device demonstrates measurable increase in accuracy and early target acquisition under combat conditions." But by then, the war was already turning. Allied armies were pushing into Germany, factories lay in ruins, and as victory drew closer, interest in small inventions began to fade. Commanders wanted speed, not experiments. Romano's mirror system, despite its success, was quietly filed away, another temporary fix in a war full of them. Still, among the crews, his invention lived on like legend. Some gunners painted little mirror symbols on their turrets. Others carried broken pieces of glass as good luck charms. They said it reminded them of the days when one man's idea changed their odds. Romano didn't care about the paperwork. He cared that his crew made it home, every single one of them. On their last mission before the end of the war, he looked into his mirror one final time. Instead of smoke and tracers, he saw the reflection of blue sky and sunlight. For the first time in years, the mirror showed peace. But history would soon forget the name of the man who built it. The official reports listed it as an unofficial field innovation, with no inventor credited. Romano returned home to Chicago quietly, without medals or recognition. Yet for those who lived because of his mirror, he would always be the man who turned reflection into survival. The war might have ended, but the paradox of his story was only beginning, how something born in the chaos of battle could vanish in the calm of peace. And what came next would show just how easily wartime heroes can fade into silence. After the war ended in 1945, Europe slowly began to breathe again. Cities were in ruins, skies were quiet, and the world was tired of fighting. The soldiers went home, some as heroes, some forgotten. Romano was one of the quiet ones. He stepped off the transport ship in New York with a small bag and a folded flight jacket that still smelled of oil and gunpowder. There were no reporters waiting, no medals on his chest, only the relief of being alive. In Chicago, he found work fixing typewriters and office machines. He liked the sound of gears clicking and metal moving. It reminded him of his days in the air. But sometimes, when he heard a plane overhead, he stopped whatever he was doing and looked up. He would remember the cold glass of the mirror in his hands, the shaking of the bomber, the flash of gunfire, and he would wonder, did the world already forget? The Air Force did not include his mirror sight in official manuals. It was mentioned in a few reports and some engineers' notes, but that was all. No patent, no award, no recognition. The paradox of his life became clear in war. His invention saved lives. In peace, it disappeared. One evening in 1948, Romano received a letter from an old crew member, Staff Sergeant Bill Parker. Parker wrote, "You probably don't remember, but that mirror saved me over Hanover. I still think about it. We owe you, pal." Romano smiled when he read it. He kept the letter folded inside his toolbox for the rest of his life. He didn't need fame. He just wanted to know that what he built mattered. In the early 1952, the U.S. Air Force introduced a new generation of bombers, the B-47 Stratojet and later the B-52. Their turrets now used electronic sights and radar-guided systems. Yet, deep inside those designs was the same principle Romano discovered. the power of seeing before being seen. In one Air Force manual from 1952, an engineer noted, improved rear-view optical systems increase gunner awareness and decrease vulnerability. No one mentioned the old mirror, but its spirit was there quietly reflected in the technology of the new age. Romano sometimes visited airfields near Chicago, watching jets roar into the sky. The smell of fuel, the tremble of engines, it all came back to him. He met younger pilots who didn't know his name but used systems inspired by his work. He never corrected them. He just smiled and said, "Keep your eyes open, that's half the battle." In 1965, during a reunion of the 91st Bomb Group, a historian asked veterans to share any unrecorded inventions or field modifications. When Romano's name came up, the old gunners cheered. One said, "He gave us eyes in the back of our heads." They told stories of missions where his mirror saved entire crews. The historian listened, amazed. He promised to include Romano's name in the group's official history booklet. But printing funds ran short, and when the booklet came out, his mention was only a short line. Unofficial rear-view mirror system, believed developed by tail gunner J. Romano, 1944. It didn't matter much to him. He had a small workshop at home, where he built models of bombers from scrap aluminum. Each one had a tiny mirror glued to its tail. Sometimes neighborhood kids would visit, and he would tell them stories in simple words. Without drama, he'd say, "War is not about being brave, it's about seeing clearly when others can't." Years passed. Romano grew old, his hands stiff from age. When he died in 1982, only a few friends and fellow veterans attended the funeral. They placed a small piece of polished metal, shaped like his old mirror, on his coffin. The sky above was clear that day, the same shade of blue he once saw through his tail window. The paradox of his life stood complete. The Air Force forgot his name, but his idea never died. Every bomber and fighter that followed carried his spirit in their sensors, their cameras, their systems that soar in all directions. He had changed the way airmen looked at the sky, even if no one remembered how it began. And while his invention was simple, just glass and light, it carried a timeless truth. Sometimes the smallest reflection can save the biggest lives. As the Cold War deepened and technology raced ahead, Romano's legacy became a whisper in history. But whispers, like reflections, have a way of lasting longer than the sound of engines. And the next generation of engineers, studying those early gunner reports, would soon rediscover what Romano had already proven, that survival in the sky begins with the courage to look back. Decades later, the world had changed. The skies that once roared with bombers were now filled with jets, satellites, and drones. War looked different, but the need to see clearly to understand what was behind and ahead was still the same. In a museum in Dayton, Ohio, a group of historians began sorting old World War II equipment for a new exhibit. Among dusty oxygen masks and rusted machine guns, one of them found a strange piece of metal with two mirrors attached. It was labeled only Field Modification, B-17 Tail Turret, 1944. A young researcher named Emily Carter became curious. She spent weeks digging through archives, reading debriefing notes and mission logs. Finally, she found several reports mentioning a mirror system developed by tail gunner J. Romano. The more she read, the more amazed she became. Here was a forgotten man who had saved lives with an idea made from scrap parts. Emily decided to find out who he was. Through veterans records, she located one of Romano's surviving crewmen, Bill Parker, now in his 92nd. When she called him, he laughed softly and said, "You're too late, sweetheart." Romano was the smartest man I ever met, and the humblest. He never cared about credit. Parker told her how the mirror worked, how it changed their chances in combat, and how the Air Force had ignored it after the war. He ended the call by saying, "Without him, I wouldn't be here to talk to you." Emily wrote an article titled "The Forgotten Mirror That Saved the Flying Fortresses." It was published in a small aviation magazine, but soon the story spread. Readers were fascinated by the idea that one soldier's creativity had quietly shaped air combat. Within months, Romano's mirror was added to the Air Force Museum's permanent collection. A small plaque read, "Joseph Romano Tail Gunner, B-17 Flying Fortress, creator of the field mirror sight that increased defensive accuracy by over 30% during World War II. Visitors often walked past it quickly, not realizing the full story behind the small, simple device. But for those who stopped and looked closer, the reflection in the mirror seemed to hold more than their own faces. It held the story of every gunner who fought to survive, and every forgotten mind that dared to think differently. The paradox lived on. In wartime, Romano's invention had been seen as breaking rules. In peace, it became a symbol of innovation. The Air Force later included his story in a digital archive on unrecognized innovators of World War II. One caption read, "The mirror sight, an example of how necessity and imagination can turn survival into invention." Romano's family, who never knew much about his service, visited the exhibit in 2010. His grandson stood in front of the mirror, touching the glass lightly. He whispered, "Grandpa." They finally remembered. The reflection stared back, quiet and proud. What Romano built was more than a tool. It was a lesson that true innovation often begins with ordinary people who refuse to stop thinking, even in chaos. He had no laboratories, no blueprints, no funding, only a piece of broken glass and the will to protect his crew. From that came an idea that outlasted the war itself. Today, modern aircraft use 360-degree sensors, cameras, and radar domes, but they all follow the same rule: see before you are seen. That idea began in the frozen skies over Germany, with a gunner who refused to fly blind. His mirror became more than metal. It became a reflection of human courage. The story of Joseph Romano reminds us of something deeper. Sometimes the world remembers generals and forgets the dreamers behind them. But every victory, every survival, often depends on the quiet minds working in the shadows. Men like Romano proved that bravery is not only in firing guns, but in thinking differently when everyone else follows orders. He once said to Parker after the war, "We all saw death out there. I just wanted to make sure death saw us a second too late." That single second, that narrow window of vision saved countless lives. And so, the mirror that once reflected smoke and fire now reflects faces of peace. Tourists pass by, children press their noses to the glass, and for a moment, the story of a forgotten gunner shines again. They came as soldiers, they left as inventors, and through their reflections, we remember the truth. America's greatest strength was never just its machines, it was its imagination.